Hello everybody, it's been a little bit of a while, but I'm actually really looking forward to getting back to this. So Dolphin Song, Lawrence and John. It is chapter 14. I hope you've been enjoying it along with me, and if you missed earlier parts, you can go back and do the videos, and if not, just follow along over here with Martine and Ben on their island where they've been marooned but were helped by the dolphins. But what's going to happen now? Chapter 14. As soon as they were out of earshot of the others, Ben said, "Phew, that's a relief." He set down the crab. Much to Sherilyn's horror, he'd scooped it up with his bare hands as they'd left. "What do we do now?" asked Martine, biting her lip. She was as glad as Ben to be away from the others, but she found it difficult to share his holiday spirit. Tendai had drummed into her that a group of lost kids had more chance if they stayed together, and the first thing this group had done was split. She was also quite shy. In the 2 months that Ben had been her unofficial best friend, she'd never actually done any best friend things with him, mainly because she only really saw him at school and he never talked there. Plus, she was not exactly up to speed with her best friend etiquette, never having had a best friend before, apart from Jemmy. And just for those who don't know, Jemmy is the white giraffe who lives on the game reserve Saubona, where Martine usually lives. "I think Claudius and Lucy are right about one thing," Ben said. "It's very likely that we'll be rescued, if not by the Coast Guard, then by a tourist boat or some local fisherman. But we can't count on it being a day or two. It might take a couple of weeks or even a month. We need to survive until then." A couple of weeks or even a month. The reality of the situation hit Martine, and a curious thing happened. A calmness came over her. She thought about Grace and the Bushman paintings on the cave wall. Only time and experience will give you the eyes to see them, the Sangoma had predicted. Martine had seen them when she was supposed to. That meant that, whether she liked it or not, this was her destiny. This African island, with its fairy-flossed dolphins and squeaking white sand and clear azure waters. And she owed it to Grace, who had counselled her on her gift, and Tendai, who'd spent hours patiently teaching her the secrets of the African landscape, as well as to Jemmy and even to her grandmother, to return safely to them. She had to wake up, be positive, and prepare herself for whatever came next. She smiled at Ben. "Should we start by making a shelter?" His eyes lit up. "Do you fancy building a fort up at the lighthouse?" Before leaving the beach, Martine filled her sweatshirt with coconuts and helped Ben search for more crabs. They found 5 large orange ones and a blue and white one with a shell-like willow patterned plate. "Sorry, fella," Ben said as he bundled them into his wind cheater, pincers waving threateningly. They didn't have a container, so they stopped at the lake and drank as much water as they could. The long climb to the lighthouse meant scaling the high honey-colored sand dunes. It was torture. Every stride Martine took created a mini avalanche, causing her to slip 2 or 3 steps back. The sand fell away in sheets. The coconuts seemed to increase in weight as she went. Halfway up, one of the crabs crawled out of a hole in Ben's wind cheater, which he had slung across his shoulders in a makeshift rucksack, and crushed his earlobe with its pincers. "Ow!" he yelled as his ear turned crimson. "Ow!" He detached the crab with difficulty and returned it to the windbreaker, telling it that it would be the first to be eaten for dinner if it wasn't careful. When they did reach the lighthouse, it was worth it just for the view. All Sahara-type dunes, green valleys, and white beaches. Seen from above, the turquoise water was streaked with splashes of jade and ultramarine blue. The island itself was triangular in shape. 2 sides of it were protected by reef, and the third was pounded by rough seas. Red cliffs reared over a rocky coastline, curving round to a calm bay. The lighthouse had the year 1902 etched above its entrance. The tower was more or less intact, but the building attached to it was in ruins and missing most of its roof. The concrete floor was cracked and the steps crumbled beneath their feet. Entire pine trees grew out of yellow fissures in the walls, Red-hot pokers nodded in the empty doorways. Pine needles whispered in the breeze. Martine and Ben walked from room to echoing room, establishing which was the most habitable. Every window framed a spectacular vista, although the glass was shattered or gone. A smudge of an island, little more than a sandbar, was just about visible through the midday haze. Martine wondered if it was Death Island. One of Alberto's tales had been about a penal colony on Santa Carolina centuries earlier. He claimed that at low tide the jailers used to take prisoners to Death Island, a tiny shell sandbar, and tell them that if they could swim the 8 kilometers or so back to the mainland, a stretch of water cursed by vicious cross currents and even more vicious sharks, they'd be exonerated, which means they would be like just totally set free from their crime sentence. Needless to say, few did. At high tide, the sea completely covered the island, and those who were unable to swim simply drowned. Martine shuddered at the thought of life so ruthlessly squandered. Ghosts? Ben asked, and she nodded without saying anything. They decided to sleep under the stars in the raised living area of what would have been the operating center of the lighthouse, beside the room with the largest section of roof intact. That way, if it rained, they could quickly seek shelter. The room would also be useful for storing food during the sweltering days. Ben dragged a couple of rocks across the doorway and set the crabs free to roam around in the shade. It was when the two of them started to stock their new home that they found they had skills which complemented one another. Martine had learned bushcraft techniques from Tendai and a little bit of island craft from Alberto, and Ben had learned how to tie knots and the basics of marine survival from his sailor father. So, for instance, while Martine knew that maintaining body heat in a survival situation was vital, and that one simple way to achieve that was to sleep off the ground, Ben was able to construct the low beds that she envisioned in her head, using a combination of bamboo and palm fronds. He tied them together with red knots, aided by the strips of bark Martine had collected with her knife. Of course, none of these things were exactly handy, and they required a further 3 grueling trips down the dunes in the heat. While they were gathering bamboo, they discovered that there really were crocodiles. Ben had to do a long jump style leap to escape from the jaws of a gargantuan male. On their last trip up the dunes, they carried 4 gourds of water, although admittedly they were only half full when they reached their destination. Martine was disappointed that the monkey oranges and cashew nuts Alberta had spoken of were not yet ripe, because it was winter. She was absolutely ravenous and had no idea how they were going to pluck up the courage to cook the innocent scuttling crabs. While Ben built the beds, Martine tied a bundle of twigs together like the African woman did at Salbona and swept the floor, choking on the thick dust. Then she gathered kindling and built a fire the way Tendai had taught her, making sure that there was plenty of space between the logs so the fire could breathe. By that time the sun was setting, and they climbed up into the old lighthouse tower and had a 360-degree panorama as the ocean turned 7 shades of red. There was no sign of the others. Half an hour after the sun slid into the sea, it was dark. Martine, who'd been used to endless summer evenings in England, could never get over the guillotine speed of nightfall in Africa, or the impenetrable blackness of it. With the switching off of the sun, the temperature plummeted sharply. Night birds and bush babies began to call and cry out softly from the trees. Martine and Ben picked their way carefully down the lighthouse's steep spiral staircase. In their absence, the fire they built had burned down to coals, and the warm glow of them lent a homely feel to their living area. They put more wood on it and sat close to toast their arms and legs, which were aching after the assault of the past 24 hours. At length, Ben gave an unhappy sigh and went off to deal with the crabs. His father had taught him how to end their lives humanely, but he was still very reluctant to do it. However, without food, their own days would be numbered. "I thought you were a Buddhist," said Martine when he returned. Don't Buddhists believe that all living things are sacred and that nothing should be harmed or injured in any way, not even mosquitoes? Haven't you heard the Buddha story about the crab? Ben asked, placing the crabs on the edge of the coals. They're pretty crafty. Once upon a time, there was this crane living beside a pond packed with fish. Every day he ate until he was stuffed, but he found that no matter how many he gobbled, he was never satisfied. He became convinced that if he could somehow eat every single fish in the pond, he'd be truly content. First, though, he had to get them all out of the water, so he told the fish that he knew of another much more beautiful pond where he'd be more than willing to carry them. One by one, they believed him, and one by one, they climbed into his beak and were eaten. Eventually, he was so full he could hardly fly, but then he noticed he'd left behind a crab. He couldn't bear the thought of such a delicious treat going to waste, so he offered the crab a ride to the pond. But the crab was smart and told the crane that he knew all about his tricks with the fish and that he had no intention of being devoured. However, he did like the idea of being transported to a special pond. He agreed to go on condition that he could ride on the crane's back with his pincers around its throat. They were almost at the pond when the crane's greediness got the better of him, and he tried to trick the crab into getting down off his back so he could eat him. The crab was so angry that he cut off the crane's head with his pincers, just slicing it off like a knife through butter. Charming, said Martine. Maybe I won't have crab for dinner after all. Ben grinned. That's all right, more for me. Actually, Buddhism does allow the eating of meat. We're just not supposed to cause pain. I'm a bit of a mix, though, because I'm also half Zulu, and some Zulus believe that fish are from the snake family and that the eating of them is forbidden. But Dad is a sailor, and the sailors love fish and the sea, so we go fishing together and we eat what we catch. Mostly, though, we do try to eat food that doesn't hurt animals. Buddhists believe that animals are equal to people, although the crabs probably wouldn't take my word for that. The night had a winter nip to it, and as they bent as near as they could to the fire, they bent as near as they could to the fire. When the crabs were cooked, they used a rock to pound the shells and ate the fleshy white meat with crystals of sea salt they'd found in a dried up rock pool, followed by more coconut for dessert. When the just check the spelling, everybody. That's dessert, not spelled correctly. When the last morsel was gone, they sat in companionable silence and listened to the sounds of the island, the squabbling bush babies, the whine of the occasional mosquito, and the faraway hiss of the sea. Behind the windowless frame of the lighthouse, the sky was a curtain of stars. It wasn't long before Martine's eyelids began to droop with exhaustion. She lay down in the low bamboo frame, rested her head on a pillow made of palm leaves, and fell asleep, thinking it the most comfortable bed she'd ever slept on. So right, so we've reached chapter 15. So it's quite nice, actually, in this terrible situation, how Ben and Martine are working together to actually make a bit of a home for themselves. So I look forward to reading next chapter with you soon.